The small bell on the glass door chimed softly, breaking the cozy silence of a cafe tucked away on a street corner in Philadelphia. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended with the familiar sounds of urban life, the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of cups and saucers, and occasionally the hearty laughter of patrons enjoying a serene afternoon. Barron Trump sat at a small table by the window, absorbed in the thick book in front of him. His tall, lean figure hunched slightly forward, as if trying to retreat into the comfort of his plain hoodie and casual jeans. No makeup, no glitz, nothing flashy to draw attention, and perhaps that was exactly what he desired. A rare moment of peace, a chance to simply be himself, unburdened by the label of being someone's son. For Barron, moments like these were precious. As the youngest son of a former president, his life was often under public scrutiny, with every action potentially becoming fodder for speculation. But here, among strangers sipping coffee and scrolling through their phones, he found a unique sense of freedom, the feeling of blending into the crowd, of being just another ordinary person. He was lost in the pages of his book when a sharp voice suddenly cut through the cafe's tranquil atmosphere. "Do you think you're better than everyone else?" The words rang out loud enough to halt all conversations. All eyes turned toward the man standing a few steps away from Barron's table. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, with a weathered face and eyes blazing with anger. His clothes weren't shabby, but they bore the marks of a hard life, unironed creases, faded patches on the shoulders, and shoes worn down at the heels. His entire demeanor exuded tension, like a tightly coiled spring ready to snap. For a split second, Barron froze, not out of fear, but from sheer surprise. This was far from what he had anticipated when he chose this cafe as a quiet retreat. The atmosphere shifted, growing tense and stifling, as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Every pair of eyes in the cafe was glued to the unfolding scene, waiting for what would happen next. "You have everything in life handed to you on a silver platter," the man continued, his voice trembling with anger. "Do you even know what it's like to fight just to survive?" The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Behind the counter, the barista hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone, ready to call for help if the situation escalated. Barron's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the man's fury. Slowly, he closed his book, setting it gently on the table, and looked up at the man. "Sir," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I'm not sure what's troubling you, but perhaps we could talk about it." The man let out a bitter laugh. "Talk? You want to talk? What could someone like you possibly say that someone like me would want to hear?" A chilling silence fell over the cafe. Everyone held their breath, bracing for what might come next. But instead of responding with anger or defensiveness, Barron did something completely unexpected, something that changed everything. Leaning back slightly, his posture relaxed but attentive, Barron exuded an air of composure. The man's anger seemed to radiate through the room, making even distant onlookers uneasy. Yet Barron remained unfazed. Instead, he gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please, have a seat," he said, his tone calm and unexpectedly inviting. The unexpected offer made the man hesitate for a moment, though his shoulders remained rigid with tension. He stood there, fists clenched, glaring down at Barron with a look of disdain. "Why should I sit with someone like you?" he spat. "You're just a spoiled kid who has no idea what real life is like." A few patrons nearby shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. The barista made a subtle movement, as though deliberating whether or not to intervene. Yet Barron maintained his composure. "Perhaps you're right," Barron admitted, his voice steady. "I've never walked your path. But if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what it's like." For a moment, the man seemed to waver. There was no challenge in Barron's tone, only a sincere invitation. Still, instead of sitting, the man leaned forward, his voice dropping but retaining its sharp edge. "You think I owe you my story? You think it'll make you feel better about yourself?" he said bitterly. Barron's gaze didn't falter. "I think everyone has a story worth hearing," he replied. The words hung in the air, resonating through the tense silence. The man hesitated, as though unsure whether to continue his verbal assault or accept this unexpected courtesy. Meanwhile, the other patrons remained riveted, their curiosity now mingled with a faint sense of hope. They weren't sure where this encounter was heading, but no one could look away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man grabbed the back of the empty chair and dragged it out with a loud scrape. He dropped into the seat, crossing his arms defensively. His jaw was tight, and his eyes scanned Barron as if searching for cracks in his calm demeanor. "All right," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The tense atmosphere in the cafe shifted, not entirely dissipating, but no longer as stifling. The barista lowered her hand and stepped away from the phone. The man took a deep breath, his chest heaving as though trying to steady himself. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, but heavy with emotion. "You look at me and think I'm just some angry guy, but you have no idea what it's like to lose everything," he began, his words laden with bitterness. He glanced around the cafe, as if daring anyone to interrupt, before turning his eyes back to Barron. "I had a job, a family, a decent life, and then the factory I worked at shut down. Just like that. Gone. Hundreds of us left with empty promises about job placements, promises that never came true." The cafe was utterly silent, save for the faint hiss of the coffee machine in the background. The man's voice began to break as he continued, the hard exterior he'd maintained slowly crumbling with every sentence. "I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids, taking whatever temp work I could find. But when you're barely scraping by, it doesn't take much to push you over the edge. My wife, she left," the man continued, his voice faltering, "took the kids with her, said she couldn't live like this anymore." He paused, his eyes glistening. "I can't even blame her." Barron remained silent, his face unreadable. Yet there was no denying the empathy in his eyes. The man's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, as if anchoring himself to something tangible to keep from being swallowed by his emotions. "Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone's looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing? That's my life now. Every single day." The man's words struck a chord, not just with Barron, but with everyone listening. A woman at the next table suddenly stared intently into her coffee, as though grappling with what she had just heard. "And then I see someone like you," the man continued, his voice rising slightly, "sitting here, wearing expensive clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. And it makes me furious, because no matter how hard I try, I'll never have what you have." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy, oppressive. Barron didn't rush to fill the silence. He let the man's pain settle, respecting its weight. Finally, Barron leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes," Barron began softly, "but I do know what it's like to be judged, to have people decide who you are before you even say a word." The man's head shot up, his eyes narrowing. "What could you possibly know about that?" Barron's response was not what anyone in the cafe expected. It shifted the conversation and the atmosphere in the room in a way no one could have predicted. Taking a deep breath, Barron's calm presence seemed to diffuse some of the tension in the air. He leaned in slightly, meeting the man's skeptical gaze. "You might think I've had an easy life because of my name, and in some ways you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table. But that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to be misunderstood." The man scoffed as if ready to interrupt. But Barron raised a hand, not to silence him, but as if to say, "Please let me finish. Wherever I go, people make assumptions about me. They think they know who I am, what I believe, what I've done, all because of my last name. They don't see me as a person. They see a caricature, someone they can project their own frustrations onto. Much like what's happening here." The man flinched slightly, as if Barron's words had struck a raw nerve. He didn't respond, but his posture shifted, his arms uncrossed, no longer a defensive barrier across his chest. Barron continued, his tone steady yet sincere. "I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours. They're not, but pain is still pain. The feeling of being unseen or never understood. That's something we all face, no matter where we come from." The cafe now fell into a peculiar kind of silence, the weighty, reflective kind. Even the barista paused mid-motion, her tray of cups momentarily forgotten. Barron leaned back slightly, giving the man space to process what he had just said. I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to understand. Because I think we're all carrying burdens others can't see, and maybe, just maybe, we'd be gentler with each other if we realized that. The man clenched his jaw, and for a moment it seemed like he might erupt again. But instead he exhaled sharply, as if releasing a weight he'd carried for far too long. You really believe that? He asked, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. Barron nodded. I do, and I think deep down, you believe it too. If you didn't, you wouldn't have shared your story with me. The man blinked, the tough exterior he'd held onto cracking further. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around the cafe as if noticing for the first time how many people were watching. A flicker of embarrassment crossed his face, but then he looked back at Barron. You're not what I thought, he admitted, his voice softer now. But what happened next wasn't remarkable because of what Barron said. It was the man's reaction that surprised everyone. The man leaned back in his chair, his body language shifting from defensive to contemplative. For a long moment, he said nothing. The cafe remained hushed, every patron engrossed in the tension of the moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice free of the earlier hostility. You know, I walked in here angry at the whole world, he said, shaking his head. Angry at people like you, people I thought were handed everything. But maybe I've been carrying that anger for too long. Maybe it has nothing to do with you at all. Barron didn't rush to respond. He let the man's words linger in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. When he finally spoke, his tone was as calm and steady as before. I think it's easy to blame people we don't know, Barron said. It's harder to face what's really hurting us. But you've done that today, and I respect that. The man looked up, meeting Barron's gaze. For the first time, there was no trace of anger, only a weary gratitude. You're a good kid, he said almost reluctantly, as though the admission cost him something. I don't say that often. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable, almost tangible. The tension that had gripped the cafe dissolved, replaced by an unexpected sense of connection. The barista smiled softly as she resumed her work. A couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, their expressions gentler now. Then the man did something that surprised everyone. He reached across the table, his calloused, weathered hand extending toward Barron. Barron hesitated for only a second before grasping it firmly. I'm sorry, the man said, his voice thick with emotion, for judging you before I really knew who you were. Barron smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his face. And I'm sorry if I've ever given you a reason to feel that way. The handshake lingered for a moment before the man withdrew his hand. He stood awkwardly smoothing his shirt and glanced around the cafe. I think I owe everyone here an apology, he said, his voice carrying across the room. I came in here angry, but this kid, he reminded me that sometimes we just need to listen. A round of gentle applause rippled through the cafe, not loud or ostentatious, but heartfelt. The man nodded, clearly moved, and headed toward the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back to Barron. Thank you, he said simply. And then he was gone. What followed wasn't dramatic, but it left everyone in the cafe with something to think about. It was a moment they wouldn't soon forget. As the door closed behind the man, the cafe seemed to collectively exhale. Conversations gradually resumed, but they weren't quite the same as before. There was a new energy in the space, a shared understanding among strangers who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Barron settled back into his seat, picking up his book and taking a sip of his now cold tea. But before he could fully retreat into his solitude, a woman from a nearby table approached him. She looked to be in her 60s, her eyes kind and her smile warm. Young man, she said softly, I just want to say, what you did was remarkable. You didn't have to listen to him, but you did. And I think you reminded all of us that sometimes kindness is all it takes to change everything. Barron nodded, his expression modest. Thank you. I think we all just want to be heard. The woman smiled and returned to her table, leaving Barron to his thoughts. Around him, the cafe buzzed with a renewed energy. Patrons exchanged smiles, struck up conversations, and engaged in small acts of kindness. Holding doors open, sharing smiles, even paying for someone else's coffee. It was as if the moment had sparked a chain reaction. By the time Barron left the cafe, the day seemed brighter, not just for him, but for everyone who had been part of that moment. The man's anger, Barron's empathy, and the simple act of listening had created a ripple effect of understanding and compassion. Dear reader, this story isn't just about Barron or the man he encountered that day. It's about all of us, about the burdens we carry, the judgments we make, and the choice we have to listen instead of react. Every day we have the opportunity to change someone's life with a simple act of understanding. Sometimes all it takes is to pause, listen, and remember that everyone is fighting battles we cannot see. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment today to practice a small act of kindness. Smile at a stranger, offer a kind word to a colleague, or simply listen to someone who needs to be heard. And if you'd like to read more stories like this, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and follow our channel. Let's spread more understanding, one story at a time.